if Trump is elected, I think every NATO member assumes that NATO will not come through if there is an expansion of the Ukraine war. For example, if Russia invades Latvia and Lithuania,
Yeah.
I don't think the United States will do anything. It'll be up to Europe. And as a result, Germany has decided that it needs to go ahead and behave like the United States is no longer their ally. And Germany has passed legislation so that it will completely remilitarize. By the time it's done with its remilitarization program, it will have the third largest military on earth, right after China, right before Russia.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. As America heads towards one of the most pivotal elections in modern history, two names dominate the stage: Trump and Harris. Will Trump's controversial past hinder his comeback? Can Harris rise above doubts to make history? Join us as Dr. Roy Casagranda, coming to us from Dubai, dives into the unpredictable paths of both candidates, their potential impacts on America, and what this race means for the future of democracy itself. You won't want to miss these insights right here on The Focus. Roy, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Roy, both Trump and Harris bring vastly different experiences and ideologies to the table. How do you believe their backgrounds uniquely prepare or challenge their capacity to lead the US?
So that's a fundamental question that I think political scientists have been asking for a little while, which is, in what manner and to what extent does the leader matter, or do the institutions matter? What role does experience play? And the United States has gotten really fascinated with the outsider without the experience of being a politician, and that's what Trump embodies.
Yeah.
But there's been a trend of doing this, especially since the election of Ronald Reagan, but even the election of Jimmy Carter. So, in 1976, not many people had heard of Jimmy Carter before the primaries. And then as the outsider, he defeats all the insiders and takes the nomination, and then defeats another insider, Gerald Ford, and becomes the president. And that's been the trend. And I think it's safe to say that most of the presidents we've elected from Jimmy Carter on have been relatively poor in terms of quality, in terms of ability to get things done. So I'm starting to lean towards the evidence is experience really does matter. And Kamala brings a really large amount of experience, both from the Senate for her time as an attorney general, and then, her time as vice president. Trump has a limited 4 years as the president. He had no political experience whatsoever beforehand. So if you're looking at it from an experience standpoint, there's no way that Trump compares to Kamala in any meaningful manner. Trump's 4 years, of course, I don't know many political scientists that would rate those well. They don't stack up very well, in part because he flounders, he switches back and forth. So if you're looking at it from the experience that he had, constantly firing members of the bureaucracy and the cabinet, waffling on issues, contradicting himself on a regular basis, I think it was a negative 4 years. There was a survey done a few years ago where they asked, I think it was 80 political scientists who were specialists in the presidency, how they had to rank the presidents, and Trump did end up as the worst, right after James Buchanan, which was shocking since James Buchanan is the guy who lets the Civil War start. You think, wow, how can you be worse than that guy?
We're still looking down the barrel of a civil war, whatever happens at the end of this circus, if you will, right? So, who knows? Maybe
Right,
Trump
so
is going to be, yeah.
Yeah, the irony is he's comparable to James Buchanan according to those political scientists, and we're looking at a second civil war, and you think, wow, how is this happening?
But look, to be fair though, Roy, there are and there have been critics of Kamala Harris. We spoke to Dr. Michael Brennis from Yale a couple of weeks back, and we specifically tried to drill down into Kamala Harris's foreign policy. But we'll go into that and Trump's a little bit later on this podcast. But what I noted was that, yes, Kamala Harris is not Donald Trump. And so, to many people who don't like Donald Trump, that is enough of a reason to vote for her. However,
Yes.
there's still quite a few people who sit down and reflect upon Kamala Harris's experience as vice president, and particularly with regard to the whole southern border immigration thing, and say, well, look, you can't put lipstick on a pig. It wasn't a great time having her as the immigration czar. And even Democrats will be quite critical of what they see as someone who herself had her flaws and was also found to be floundering or at least not taking decisive action. So yeah, it makes for, from an Australian perspective, and I'm just looking at it from an outsider's viewpoint, it makes it very difficult to look at the United States and look at the two candidates and have any degree of faith that they will guide the ship of the United States in a good direction. Because, if it all falls over and there's a possibility of that happening, us little guys, we're going to be smashed to pieces. And we're not looking forward to that happening. So, yeah.
Yeah. So you said we're going to get into Kamala's foreign policy later, so I won't start there.
Mm.
If Kamala is vice president, I think the biggest critique has been the immigration policy.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused about immigration. And here's where I get stuck. So the United States, I think, has been running about 2 million people per year immigrating into the United States. For the longest time, it was about 1.5 million. But it was about 1.5 million 125 years ago. The US population is more than 3 times what it was 125 years ago. So as a percentage of the population, our immigration is less than 1/3 what it used to be. In other words, we're not seeing the kind of immigration that we saw in the year 1900 or the year 1899. That's one thing that I think is interesting about the current arguments against allowing more immigrants is that we're actually in a way at our lowest peak ever. Having said that, I also don't understand the resistance to immigrants. They are the labor force that drives the economy. They add to the economy. They add billions of dollars to the economy. And in the United States, we have a problem with affluenza. The population of people who were born and raised in the United States simply don't have the kind of work ethic that immigrants bring in. And it is the number one reason why employers say they want to hire immigrants, including undocumented immigrants. It's not the pay, it's the fact that they never call in sick. They're there all the time. In other words, if we created a fair system where immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, but all immigrants, had the same kinds of protections that a citizen has for worker rights, it would force the citizens to actually start to become better workers because it would force them to compete with the behavior of the immigrant population. And
Roy, this is a very familiar argument to all immigrant countries. I'm sure that the Canadians have a variant of this. Here in Australia, we certainly do. And I recall many years ago when we were playing around with the idea of moving into multiculturalism because, there were so many native Australians who were worried about immigration coming in from Southeast Asia at the time post-Vietnam, that they thought that,
Right.
our culture was going to be sort of swamped under by Asians and so on and so forth. Those are old arguments that are very hard to push aside. And I think that it shows a vulnerability in terms of the way that we view ourselves as people in immigrant societies. You're absolutely right. Immigrants are the foundation of our societies. Without them, things would not be working as they have worked up to now. But, the nativists also have their own level of concerns. Those concerns are basically played upon by the predatory instincts of a lot of the media. The media like to make big stories about, there are all these exaggerated claims going about. And it's interesting because we did actually speak to someone about the US border issue, probably about, 4 or 5 months back. And she was saying to us that, you know, like yourself, there's no real problem, but it's a problem of perception rather than a problem of reality. And there,
100%.
and there was another thing, an interesting thing that we said as well with another guest of ours, and he's a demographer in the United Kingdom, and he said, you know, if all of these people who are so worried about immigration would go out and have children, we wouldn't have an immigration crisis.
Yeah.
Again, you know. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And so having said all this and agreeing with everything you just said, I think the component that's really at stake falls back to good old-fashioned US
yeah,
racism. At the end of the day, the immigrants coming are brown and black, and that's what's really bothering the population. You know, like, so I'll pick on my own family. I had a relative say, I don't like what immigrants are doing to our country. And I went, you mean like bringing hamburger and pizza and spaghetti? And he's like, what do you mean? Those are American foods. And I went, oh, can you say that in Cherokee? I would love to hear it in the native language, right? And then we
right.
had this,
Good
and so
comeback.
right, what are you talking about? And I'm related to him on my grandfather's side. He went to the United States in 1905. It's like our feet are still wet from the Atlantic crossing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know how somebody whose ancestors got to a place in 1905 can claim they're a native. In any case, having said all of that, in Texas, I'll pick on Texas in particular because we've seen a lot of stuff done by our governor, Greg Abbott. One of the
Yes.
things that he's doing was putting people on buses and transporting them to the Yankee states. And that was a tactic that was done in the 1960s, where they would tell African American families, there's a job and an apartment waiting for you in New York. We're just going to put you on this bus and send you. And then, of course, they get off the bus and there's nothing waiting for them. And so it was like a playbook right out of the old segregationists, we're fighting against civil rights thing. And so I feel like that's what's really at stake in the imagination of the average American, including my cousin that I had this conversation with. What he really meant was the darkening of the country.
Wow.
White people have a negative population growth in the whole planet, but including the United States. And so you're right, like at some level, maybe have some kids and I don't know, teach them a stronger work ethic.
Yeah, look, you know, I hear you. I hear you. With Trump's prior presidency marked by polarizing policies and Harris's role as vice president under intense scrutiny, what do you see as their core strengths and weaknesses as presidential candidates in this current political climate?
So Trump is a fascinating person because he'll say something and he clearly doesn't know anything about the topic when he says it, and you're like, oh, I can't believe he said this. So I'll give you a recent one that I'm still marveling over. He wanted to put 100% tariff on all cars imported from Mexico.
Yeah.
Well, all cars imported from Mexico, half of those cars are Ford, GM, and Chryslers, because when we signed the NAFTA agreement that he renamed the USMCA, when we signed the NAFTA agreement in the 90s under the Clinton administration, Ford, GM, and Chrysler were on the verge of going bust. There was literally nothing holding them up other than, government subsidies. Yeah. And NAFTA, what it did was it allowed those three companies to put factories in Canada to get better skilled labor and put factories in Mexico for the cheaper parts that didn't require the skilled labor. And then what those three corporations they weren't just multinational in the sense that they had, plants in Vietnam and the Philippines. They were multinational because so much of the work was done in Mexico and Canada, to the point where the average part in a US, I'm doing air quotes, a US car crosses the border between Mexico and Canada 8 times before it's in the car and completed. And so the idea of banning or putting 100% tariff on Mexican cars is the equivalent of basically blocking America's own cars. And you think, how did you get here? Did you not want to talk to somebody before you had this conversation? Do you not remember the USMCA and the big thing you made about, he made some tiny little changes and renamed the whole thing and talked about how glorious it was. And he clearly doesn't even realize that the two are linked together. So
Well, I'm reminded about that recent interview that Trump did with now I can't remember the fellow's name, but he was a journalist in Bloomberg, and anyway, he was giving Trump a few hard lessons about the economy and what his economic prescriptions would be all about, and Trump did not like that because he was completely out of his depth.
yeah, the poor guy.
Oh, my heart bleeds, really.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. You don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
So this makes me think of Dwight David Eisenhower. So I am not a fan of Eisenhower's foreign policy, but I think as a person and as a president, he overall had some really amazing moments that make me want to look to him at least as an example. Like you don't always have to agree with the person to think that
Yeah.
they had some good stuff going. And one of the things that Eisenhower did when he became president was he said, "Look, I'm a general. I know how to take men into combat. I know how to move logistics. I don't know how to run a first-class global economy. So I need help." And he went and he hired a professor from an Ivy League university to come in on Fridays for 1 hour every Friday and give him a lesson on the economy. And he admitted it to the public. Like this wasn't a secret.
Yeah.
He was owning his inadequacy, and he did it for 8 years. And you think, oh, wow, first humble, and then
Yeah.
second, fix the problem instead of pretending you know all the answers. I don't know how we can't get back to that place where, the American public went, yeah, okay. We weren't crazy about presidents in wheelchairs, but at least we thought it was cool that we had a president that was humble and willing to make changes. Whereas Trump is the exact opposite. He knows nothing, and then he presents it, and then you shake your head and wonder how his advisors didn't warn him off of this, and then we just move on.
And so, okay, it's easy to beat up on Trump, and we're going to be doing a lot of that throughout this
So
podcast.
let's beat up on Kamala.
Yeah, let's beat up on Kamala because again, the same thing applies. I mean, what does she stand for in terms of the economy? I've been doing as much watching and listening of podcasts and vodcasts and various other social media to know that whatever she's saying about the economy, if I was an American, I'd say, what? I mean, where's the beef? What is she really all about? Because to me, and I think to a lot of casual observers, Kamala Harris is going after the low-hanging fruit, and that is follow in Biden's footsteps. Don't put too much of a foot wrong. Everything will work out okay. Biden was old and decrepit, but he surrounded himself with competent people. If I do the same sort of thing, I can come up with all sorts of policies which are going to be beneficial for the country. But can it? Is it that easy? I don't know.
Yeah, so Kamala is trapped by the two-party system. I don't know what her actual beliefs are, because if you follow her path to the White House, she has definitely changed her position. If you listen to her in the 2020 presidential primary debates before she dropped out, she sounded like Bernie. She was very far left on just about everything. And it was exciting because there were three Bernies in the race. There was her and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie.
Yeah, yeah.
And so at some level, because she was not a Bernie style vice president, at some level, it's difficult to pin her down on exactly what she believes. In the United States, the Democratic Party is a center-right party. People get really confused about this. It is the leftmost party in the United States, but it is not a leftist party. It is a center-right party. The Republican Party used to be a far-right party. It is now an extreme far-right party. So it is flown even further to the right than where it used to be. But the Democratic Party is still a right-wing party that has based itself on how do we save capitalism. So in 1932, that's what FDR ran on, was I'm the guy who's going to save capitalism from an impending socialist revolution. And he got elected. He does the deal. The deal gets shot down by the Supreme Court. He threatens to cheat. So they do the New Deal. The New Deal gets through because the court doesn't want him to cheat. And the lasting effect was this sort of similar to Europe, but not quite that far, social network system, social welfare system, like a very watered down version of Europe. The Reagan guys come in and they say, look, we hate this. It's socialism. It's ruining the country. We need to get rid of it. Jesus probably wouldn't have approved. And that's what they've been trying to do. That's been the mantra for the last 44 years, tear down FDR's legacy. And they have successfully done some of it, especially under the Clinton administration. Clinton was the best Republican ever. I know he was a Democrat. He's the guy who got rid of Glass-Steagall, for example. Like so many of the safeguards that were put into place by the liberal Democrats got undermined by Clinton. The problem with Kamala is what she's saying isn't exciting because it's essentially the 1932 message with a little bit of nuance of we're going to save capitalism by giving the workers enough crumbs to keep them from doing a socialist revolution. And I think that's not only boring because it's been done before, it's the playbook that the Democrats have been using for decades and losing on. It's one of the interesting things that Bill Clinton did was he said, you know what, I'm kind of throwing out the playbook. I'm gonna move to the right and I'm gonna try and meet George Bush Sr. part way and basically cut him off of the middle. And it worked in his case. Kamala does have moments where she talks about, she wants to improve the opportunities for working class families. Trump says similar things. The policies that they're proposing, I don't think will have any meaningful impact on working class families. At the end of the day, I think it's mostly just window dressing. And the plan is to keep American style capitalism intact.
I just want to haul you over with regard to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's relationship with Labor in America. Now, Harris doesn't come from the same sort of background as Biden. Biden was very much a sort of supporter of unions and very much a working man's working man. But Harris is an LA liberal. I'll use the American term, not the Australian term. And so, she has all these newfangled hippie, some would say woke, progressive ideology that, has dogged her throughout her career. And now she has to, because now she's running for the president, she's going to have to be a woman for all Americans, not just for the people who think that she's pretty good on certain issues.
Yeah.
How do you think this is going to set Harris up for success when in the most unlikely universe that we live in, it's the mega capitalist Donald Trump who's getting all the disaffected labor people, the people who were in the Rust Belt states, have got no jobs, they're of a certain age, they can't be retrained, they know that they're screwed basically. And yet, promises are being made by Donald Trump, which cannot be kept under any condition whatsoever. And yet Harris sees an opportunity where if she were more on message and she could tap into, well, look, okay, I had my woke moment. It's not something that I'm going to drive into the White House. If you elect me as president, I'll be a president for all Americans and I'll be much more broad-based. She's not cutting through with that message either, which means that those people who are sitting on the fence have really no candidate to go for. So again, what's going on?
Yeah. So this is the argument I keep having with my wife, actually.
Right.
My wife keeps telling me Kamala needs to stake out the space where she's taking on the issues that especially Gen Z, but millennials are also interested in, and those disaffected workers that can't be retrained. And she needs to become the labor class candidate. She needs to become the peace candidate. She needs to become the let's redistribute the wealth candidate. Right. And the reason it's an argument, because I don't disagree. I just see her locked into the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party's elites, which are all about how do we protect corporate interests and how do we exploit American labor and maximize profits. So we had a moment because of FDR where the United States reevaluated the way it was going to interact with workers, the way it was going to interact with people. And we really did soften. some extraordinary things came out of this that I don't think we can comprehend anymore. So the Golden Gate Bridge, this icon of icons, and I'm picking it in part because of where Kamala is from. The Golden Gate Bridge was built because the voters in the counties that surrounded San Francisco Bay, those voters voted to mortgage their homes and fund the construction of this bridge. Today, that would be beyond impossible. There is no way American voters would ever agree to something like that. And so, in other words, there's been a big sea shift in the way Americans think about their wealth and their community and the way they interact with each other, and in a way that I think we've lost something really crucial. But, like being able to cooperate to build a bridge that will just make our lives better. That's what society is for. That's what civil society is for. I don't understand this place that we're in now. The Reagan. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It's all about monopolies. It's all about capitalism, and as wealth is concentrated. Well, wealth is concentrated in fewer hands.
It's true.
And that goes hand in hand with political power. So guess who gets the first bite of the cherry on this issue, right?
Yeah.
No one has that strategic vision.
By the time we got to 1973, so Nixon's fourth year in office, the trend towards making the United States more and more of an egalitarian society had reached its high water mark. That was the closest we ever got. I think we were down to a 41 or a 42-hour work week. We never hit 40, but the average, I think we're at 50 now. So we've been going the opposite direction ever since. Europe is switching over to 35 and we're at 50, heading towards 51. We're going the wrong direction. The top 1% earned 8% of the wealth generated in 1973. Today, the top 1% makes 40% of the wealth generated. So what we've done is we've made the United States less and less equal, more classist. The wealth is concentrated in the handful of a few. And the bottom 60%, I think they split something like 7% of the wealth. So from the standpoint of wealth distribution, the United States doesn't look like a developed country. It looks like a third world country. It's a third world country where everybody has big TVs and has easy access to Netflix. And in that scenario, you can totally understand why there's this disgruntled class of people who are feeling like they got left behind, they got left out, in part because they are looking at the wealth that their parents generate. So I'm X generation, and a big portion of this are X generation, although some of them are the younger baby boomers too. And what the baby boomers managed to pull off was live through the greatest period of US economic development, and they prospered and they generated some very amazing wealth. And now millennials are thinking they'll never own a house, they'll never own a car. They're stuck in this sort of malaise of stagnation, economic stagnation. The problem isn't Kamala or Trump or their policies. The problem is what we started doing in the 1970s and 80s to reverse the trend toward being an egalitarian society. The likelihood you will change class in the United States is where the UK was in 1973. The UK is with a hereditary nobility and a monarchy has more class fluidity than the United States. It did 51 years ago. Like that stat alone just blows my mind. Like, how did we get here? This is craziness. And the craziness came from the Reagan Revolution, although Nixon obviously wanted to do this. He just wasn't quite as successful as Reagan was at pulling it off. And we've now gotten stuck into this. We hate taxes. We think that the rich deserve to be rich because they somehow earned it, which is an absurd idea. We don't think they have to pay their fair share. And we're willing to allow this to go that direction. And in the process, we killed our unions. I'm a union member. I pay my dues. I know I will never get anything from it. I do it just because I feel like in principle I have to. I vote in Texas, even though I know my vote is mostly lost, because I feel like in principle I have to, as a citizen, do these things. But at the end of the day, our unions are so destroyed. If we could bring the unions back, I think Kamala would have a better chance. Because in America, and I suspect this is true in every single electoral republic, so every place that has free and fair elections and where the citizens have some power in picking the government, you can't get your legislature to do something if the legislature isn't being forced to do it by the voters.
That is
And
true. Yeah.
and without
Yeah.
collective bargaining, there is no reason on earth for the United States Congress to ever pass any kind of law that would actually make the working conditions in the United States better. I mean, we haven't had a minimum wage pay increase in 30 something years. I can't remember the last time. It was $7.25 an hour last time I did it. That's insane.
It is insane. But can I say that just as a casual observation to this discussion, when you're talking about unions and the lack of unions, I mean, we've gone through this whole process here. We still have unions, but they've been really smashed down, quite frankly. So we are going the American way. We're looking toward the Americans as our,
Don't
look, I get what you're saying, but if, Canberra, which is our political bubble, they're kind of like in their cocoon. They look at America for leadership at the strategic level, at the economic level, at the social level. And all the things that we were known to be very good at, especially our social welfare, it's being cut and destroyed and burned. And if you go to our right wing, the Liberal Party, the Liberal National Coalition, that they're our sort of Republicans, basically. They also are starting to drift further right, and they're losing, because we used to mythologize the egalitarianism of Australia. It was all about our mates and we'd all stick with our mates. And, there was this thing about the community coming together at a very grassroots level. And it was part of Australia's developmental culture. But I have seen it now starting to really disappear. And, when you're looking at Generation X and Alpha and whatever, they just don't have it at all, which then leads to another thing, which I'm also observing, because in America, whatever you've said has been, I think it's verifiable. Does that also mean then that desperate people cling to the idea that if they get someone they empathize with in the White House, that the big person, whether male or female, is going to, I don't know, wave the magic wand and make their life better, more meaningful? I don't know.
I definitely think that a huge portion of what motivates people to vote, and this is probably global, but it may be at times more pronounced than at other times, is meaning. And by casting your vote, you're making an identity claim, right? It's a completely anonymous event because of the Australian ballot, which, by the way, I'm very grateful for. Thanks. That was a great invention. I want to say we got it in the United States in the 1890s. So we've been doing it for a century and a quarter or something like that. Even though it's an anonymous event, you still know how you voted. And you can tell your friends how you voted. And you can still make the claim, I am X. So I think that's part of it. I think also, unfortunately, politicians have discovered that if they can kind of present themselves in a little bit of a fluid way where they're not completely pinned down on everything, the voters can look at them and then assign beliefs that they have about that person to that person. And then, right, that allows the politicians to sort of manipulate the voters into believing, if you vote for me, I will solve your problems. I'm your fixer. I mean, but the strange thing about this is it's not just in electoral republics. Thomas Hobbes talks about this in the Leviathan, where the people need a sovereign that they can look to and put all of their hopes and dreams and aspirations and their need for security into it. And then the sovereign will, make the right choice, because no matter what the choice the sovereign makes it's still the right choice, which is a little bit of a loop-de-loop. But in any case, I do think that's a fundamental flaw with the system and the way the direction it's heading in, or has been heading in. And I think people's disgust, right? Voter turnout this election will probably be somewhere between 50 and 55%. So it's not going to be the high voter turnout. At least that's what it looks like. We'll see for sure. It doesn't look like it's going to be the high voter turnout we had in 2020. We got to 67%, which was a 120-year-long record. We were so thrilled. Political scientists, when in the United States, when we get to 67, like we have a massive party, and we can't believe, wow, 2/3 of the American public care. This is amazing.
See, I don't understand why you guys don't do what we do, and that is have mandatory federal voting. Like everyone has to do their bit. Ancient Greece was all about compelling the citizens to vote. It wasn't about,
Yes.
oh, well, today I don't feel like going out there, the weather's not fine, or my boss is giving me a hard time. No, you went out, cast your ballot, or else you were ostracized. There was no middle ground here. Why don't we understand that about democracy? I don't get it. No.
I don't get it. It's so weird.
No.
I mean, think about it. This is your chance to be in charge. Why wouldn't you want to be in charge?
Yeah.
Well, the monarchy.
Yeah.
By the way, just for the record.
Yeah. Well, true. Yeah. Anyway, let's get back to basics. So many view Trump as a symbol of populism. Some say he's a fascist, and Harris an unapologetic progressive extremist. In your analysis, Roy, how accurately do these labels reflect their actual policy intentions and approaches to governance?
Yeah, so unfortunately, Kamala is definitely not a populist extreme, or I'm sorry, a progressive extremist. I wish she was. That would be exciting. She's just an old-fashioned neoliberal who's planning to get in there. At least that's what it looks like. You know, sometimes presidents get in there and they surprise you. And if Trump wins, he'll be the second president in U.S. history who had a term, who lost, and then who had a second term on the other side of the guy he lost to. The first guy who did that was Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland ran on switching the dollar to the silver standard and doing all these things to help the working class. That was his mandate. He wins. He actually won 3 elections in a row, but because of the way the Electoral College worked, he won the popular vote the second time, but lost the Electoral College. So that's why he had this split. In his second victory, third victory, the one that he won the popular vote and the Electoral College, he betrayed everything he had promised the voters and went exactly the opposite direction. So you really don't know what a president's going to do until they get into the White House, which is also something that's always kind of shocked me about voters. Like, wait, at some level, politicians are liars. How is it that you believe what they're saying? Have some skepticism. Yeah. Like, how many times do you have to be hoodwinked? Every 4 years. Like, why can't you figure out that there's a little bit of deception here? In any case, from what it looks like, and if Kamala's 4 years as vice president is any indicator, she's going to get in there and mostly just be an old style liberal in the US sense. Her job will be to protect corporate interests, but give the working class just enough to prevent them from being angry all the time.
So having said that, then there is this other phenomenon that we were all witness to recently with Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. swapping teams, going from independent to Republican. How does that work in the scheme of things? I mean, yeah, talk about the electoral colleges and that whole 17th century notion of voting, which no one really understands. I don't even think the Americans do. What happens when someone like RFK Jr. enters the fray? Does it help or hinder Trump?
So it was definitely helping Trump. And people began to speculate, including myself, that RFK was actually a Trump agent, that he was in the race to take votes away from Kamala. There was a phone call between Trump and RFK right after the first assassination attempt. And, Trump's going on and on and on. And I heard a snippet of it, and RFK sounds like a person in a subservient role listening to what his boss is telling him to do and what his boss is telling him to think. And it was kind of shocking because, it wasn't meant to be released, the conversation, but it got leaked. And in my mind, it erased any possibility that RFK was anything other than a Trump agent. In the United States, because the way we use single member district representation, we really have a permanent two-party system. There are other states on the planet that use it. For example, the UK still uses it. They have multi-parties. They don't have a two-party system, but it's worth pointing out that most of them are regional. Right? There's 3 parties at the top that aren't, but most of the rest of them are regional. So in the case of the United States, what ends up happening is if you have a third-party candidate, let's say you have a close election where it's 45% for one candidate, 35% for the second candidate, and 20% for a third candidate. If you vote for the third, and let's say that on a left-right continuum, you pick which is right and left. You love candidate C, the guy with the 20%, and you hate candidate A, the guy with the 45%. If you vote for candidate C, then the guy then candidate A wins because there's no runoff election. It's just the first place wins. You don't have to have a majority. But if you hold your nose and go, I really don't like B, but B is preferable to A, and you go vote for B, B walks away with 55% of the vote. And periodically, Americans have to relearn this lesson, and then they learn it, and they go, oh, okay, I can't vote third-party candidate anymore. I keep ending up with the wrong guy. And I think that was what RFK's role was to steal votes from Kamala.
Wow. Okay.
Having said that, when he finally did admit that he was an agent of Trump and went over to the Trump camp, I thought that was really shocking because I couldn't figure out why he didn't just stay in the race. Because even if he peeled away half a percentage of Kamala's vote, he could have made a big difference.
Yeah.
Jill Stein will. She could conceivably cost Kamala the election.
Really? Wow. Oh, never really thought of that.
In Pennsylvania, which is maybe, it's the Keystone State, that's its nickname, but it looks like it's the keystone for this election.
Yeah.
There's essentially no path for Trump to win without winning Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Kamala could lose Pennsylvania. If she picks up another state, she could be okay. Another state being like North Carolina or Georgia. Right now, the way the polling is, she's going to lose Georgia and North Carolina, so she really needs to win Pennsylvania. It's going to be a very close race. I mean, it might be 1,000 votes difference between who wins in Pennsylvania. So if Jill Stein took half a percentage away from Kamala, that's a disaster.
Yeah, tell me something, Roy. There's been a lot of polling happening in the recent months. One set of polls are very much favorable toward Trump. The other set of polls are favorable toward Harris. If you were a political analyst, like we are, what do you make sense of all of this? I mean, this is the first time, I think, in American history that you can look at a bunch of polls and still not really understand what's going on. There doesn't seem to be that level of objectivity. It's almost as if the polls themselves are now divided. They're split and supporting their respective candidates. I don't get it. I mean, there's so many things about this election that is just so atypical of anything that came before it that I don't know.
Yeah, the polling is really weird, in part because polling used to be so reliable until about 2016. And then it just seems like all of a sudden polling fell apart. And you're right. Little by little, it's come out, like Gallup is a little bit to the right and Zogby is a little bit to the left, right? And so, and then Nate Silvers is trying to be in the middle, but he leans a little left, right? And so there too much politics have got into the polling data. But I'm wondering too about how the polls are being constructed and then implemented, because you're right, there is a lot of variance. So what some people have been doing, and Nate Silvers obviously made a name doing this, is taking all the polls and then aggregating them and trying to create a trend line. If you look at the data, looking through the lens of the trend line, it's a pretty strange election, for not just because it's so close, but also because nothing seems to really move it. So, when the assassination attempt missed, the poll moved by like 1%. Yeah. When Kamala got into the race and Biden dropped out, the poll moved like 1%. You would think those were earthquake events and you'd see these big fluctuations. It's a flat line. There's no movement. You don't ever want to see a flat line on a heart monitor. You need to see some movement. That just sounds like the patient's dead.
Well, maybe the American constituency is dead tired of all of this I don't know, three-ring circusry that's going around at the moment. I mean, it's just like you turn on the TV or you listen to your favorite podcast and you get bombarded by such a lot of crap. And
It's
it's
true.
difficult. It's difficult to just, treat politics in this sort of condition seriously.
So I agree with that, and it's disappointing. Okay, so there was an experiment done, and I really love this experiment where they did the jelly beans in a jar thing, where you have people guess, and there was a prize, $50 or something like that, or $25. Nothing that you get too worked up about. And then they had people guess, and by people guess, I mean like 1,000 people, so that you're going to get a big N on your data set. And what they found was that when you had about 1,000 people guessing, the average would land so close to the exact number, it was creepy. In other words, but then you'd have these outliers. Maybe if you had 1,000 jelly beans in the jar, somebody will say 100,000 and somebody will say 10. And you're like, how did you get these? So there's outliers in it, but you average all of the data and it would land on 1,000 or really close. And so what that tells me is that as a species, we're really good as a community at getting to the right answer.
Yep.
So then you would think if we applied this to elections, then we should be able to do the same thing. And here's where I think it went sideways. It's the emotions we bring into it. If I ask you to guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, you're probably not especially emotional about that. You're probably like, oh, I don't know. And then you throw out a number. You probably thought about it for all of 3 seconds. You didn't spend 2 years thinking about it, for example. It was a quick number. You went with your intuition. You probably didn't have a lot of emotion.
Yeah.
We've made politics so emotional. The media, the politicians. The media does it because they want ratings. The politicians do it because they're trying to get you to show up. In the United States, that's especially important since half the electorate will stay home if they're not roused up. And in 2020, people were thinking, oh my God, if Trump is elected, the country will be destroyed. And all of a sudden, people showed up and started voting.
Yeah.
They've apparently forgotten that emotion, and they have a new emotion. I don't know what it is, but the idea that we're going to make a rational decision as a community, I think, is gone. And we're now stuck in this cycle of they're evil, I'm good, I hate them, and I just need their side to lose. I don't even care what my politician is saying anymore. And that's a really bad place to be. So in a way, I do think the American political system is flatlined because it's a little bit dead. There isn't any meaningful conversation happening.
Yeah. No, I get that.
It's a disaster.
It is. Okay, so from one disaster, let's move into the other. And that is, what role does religion play in all of this? Now, Donald Trump has been doing a lot of, well, I don't know, talking about his love of God. He's got the Trump Bible, because, of course, God endorsed Trump. And I'm just wondering where the American religious groupings are sort of forming, because I mean, obviously Kamala Harris, being the person that she is, wouldn't have a great deal of traction with that segment. But what I don't understand, and maybe you can clarify this for me, is how do people who are religious or religiously inclined look at Trump and all of his, dare I say, bad behavior, anti-religious behavior? If he walks into a church, I expect that all Bibles would just spontaneously combust. But I mean, why are they voting for him?
Okay, this has been a serious cultural conundrum that a lot of people have been trying to figure out. Like, I'll ask people when I get into these conversations, okay, but do you think he's a sinful person? They go, oh yeah, he's very sinful. I go, okay,
Right.
okay. We're all sinners. That's cool. But like on the scale of like, you are a Christian, he's a Christian. Do you think he's really doing a good job? And they'll go, nah, And then why are you voting for him? You know, like at least with Reagan, there was the illusion that he was a born-again Christian and he was trying really hard to live the Christian life. And I don't know that many people believe that that's the case with Trump. I'm sure there was somebody, but as a general rule, I suspect there's a little bit of suspicion. So that has been really fascinating to watch. I mean, if you're a psychologist, there's so much cognitive dissonance floating around right now that I really feel like you could be having a field day with just processing cognitive dissonance. So I think one thing that's worth remembering is the history of religion in American politics in the past. So before Jimmy Carter, James Earl Carter, who is still alive, which is amazing to me. By the way, he's my favorite ex-president. He has just been such a phenomenal ex-president. He wasn't great as a president, but as an ex-president, he's been amazing. Before him, it was taboo for presidents to talk about religion at all, and they just avoided it. The only exception was Kennedy. Kennedy came out and said, yes, I'm Catholic. I will not allow that to affect the way I govern. So he came out and dismissed his religion and made a very secular statement. James Earl Carter, in a Playboy interview in 1976, why was he interviewing for Playboy? I don't know. Says, I am a born-again Christian and I will listen to God. I am going to seek his counsel in my prayers. I will govern as a Christian. Of course, Reagan runs with it, and that's been our history ever since. So the idea of the separation of church and state was destroyed in an instant, and we've never gotten back to it. It's also worth remembering in the United States that traditionally people who identified as strongly Christian, like what we would call evangelical, that population of people up until the 1970s, we would have thought of them as leftists, not right. So today in the United States, we'll say religious right, but up until the 1970s, it was the religious left. Most of them believed, most of the people that identified as evangelical and were involved in politics believed that Jesus was essentially a little bit lefty, that he would have taken care of the poor. He would have wanted there to be medicine for the poor. He would have let immigrants into the country. He would not have treated the African-American community as brutally as we were. He wouldn't have wanted to genocide Native Americans. And so as a rule, most of that population was in the 1960s demonstrating alongside the anti-war protesters, the civil rights protesters, and the hippies. And so it's hard for us to remember that. In the 1970s, there was this moment where effectively church leaders and Republican Party officials were meeting, and the Republicans were telling them, we will give you money to help you fight sin. Because even though those people were in the trenches fighting for civil rights, they didn't want people smoking pot, and they didn't want people doing premarital sex, and they didn't want them listening to rock and roll. And the Republican Party realized that in the 70s and began to lure these churches away from their leftist beliefs into a combat against sin. And of course, once sometime around 78 or 79, they realized abortion was the thing. Once they rallied around abortion, they basically just took off and the Republican Party became like the religious right party, which it had never really been. It was just a secular capitalist party prior to that. So religion has played this massive, heavy-handed role in US politics that in the last 44 years that it never played prior to that. And I think, we didn't know what to do with it other than hope the courts would stop this, but the courts are appointed by our politicians, and our politicians began appointing people who thought it was okay to get rid of the secular nature of the United States. And so as a result, we have become increasingly more and more a theocracy and less of a secular state. Texas, for example, is completely run by the extreme far right religious fanatics. And I'm a Texan, so this has been a nonstop irritation for me because, fine, do your thing. Just why are you forcing everybody else to do it? So Trump is a weird phenomenon in so many ways because he's so clearly not religious. He fakes it. how people are buying into the idea that somehow this guy that they don't think is the guy is the guy. I don't understand. So weird.
Okay, so both candidates have supporters who believe they represent the real America. Roy, what does this say about the current divisions in American society, and how might each candidate's platform address or deepen these divides?
The fact that we keep having this conversation about what is a real American is just mind-boggling to me. I, as a kid, and by kid, I mean like a 20, 30-year-old, whenever I would criticize the United States, US policy, domestic or foreign or whatever, it was a common mantra to say love it or leave it. And the thought in my head was the person trying to make the thing better probably loves it more than the guy who's just leeching off of the thing. And, like in my mind, the critic was the person who loved the system. They spent the time learning it and trying to figure out what we were doing wrong.
Yeah.
So there's always been this kind of conversation about that. Having said that, in 2008, there was an earthquake, and it was Barack Obama. So I'm going to give an anecdote because I feel like the anecdote does a really good job of illustrating what happened. I had a friend of 17 years, and he lived in Arizona. I lived in Texas. Every chance we got, we would hook up. Like one time he was going to Florida, he stopped and we hung out. And another time I went to Arizona just to hang out with him. And I really love this guy. I still do. I still love him. But we really haven't talked in about 16 years. And the reason is he went off the deep end. He kept saying, I can't believe, and then insert N-word, that this N-word is going to get elected president. Why doesn't David Duke take some of his KKK friends out there and go shoot this guy? Well, insert N-word again. And like my heart broke because here's this guy that I really loved who went off the deep end. And that's where the whole birther movement started. And Trump, of course, was one of those birthers. And the argument was, how can Obama be president? He wasn't even born in the United States. So for the record, there's this thing, it's a document, it's called the Constitution. It's written in English, so everybody who speaks English could actually read the thing. It'd be amazing if anybody in the United States ever did. It doesn't say you have to be born in the United States to be president of the United States. It says you must be born a natural citizen. So there are two ways to be born a natural citizen. One is you're born in the United States, period. Doesn't matter if your parents were citizens, doesn't matter if they were undocumented or documented. If you're born in the United States, you're instantaneously a natural citizen. The other way is you're born to US parents and your parents register your birth. There's a time limit. I don't know what it is, but there's a time limit your birth must be registered in. And if you can get it done by that time, you are instantaneously a natural citizen and eligible to run for president. For example, Ted Cruz, who was born in Canada, was eligible to run for president when he did. He was not violating the Constitution. And of course, there were a lot of Republicans who voted for Ted Cruz who were claiming that Obama was born in Indonesia or Kenya and therefore not eligible to be president. Well, Ted Cruz wasn't born in the United States. But here's the twist. John McCain wasn't born in the United States. The guy Barack Obama was running against was born in Panama. Last time I checked, who is in the United States. But even if it wasn't, it wouldn't matter. That's not the rule. John McCain was 100% eligible to run for president, unless the Supreme Court comes in and goes, no, we've misinterpreted that very simple sentence that says natural born citizen. Yeah. John McCain had every right to run for president both times that he did, right? He lost in the primaries in 2000. And those birthers were people who had voted for John McCain, turned around, couldn't stand the idea that Obama was president. Well, that tells me that either A, they didn't spend any time researching the issue and they just were following what other people were saying, or B, this was code for something else. And the code for something else is this argument of what's a real American. And of course, the answer was that a guy that was half Black who was born in Kenya can't be a real American. And that was, I think, a driving force. And that's, Kamala has it three ways, right? She's Indian, Jamaican, and a woman. Like, if she gets elected, that might make me want a theocracy because I might believe in a God. Like, it'd be a miracle that she's overcoming so many obstacles: anti-Asian hate, anti-black hate, and misogyny.
Roy, didn't I hear the other night that Tucker Carlson at the Madison Square rally called Kamala Harris Samoan and Malaysian as well? So you can add that to the mix too?
Well, I didn't know that about her.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Neither did I. Obviously,
I
Tucker
wonder if
knows
she
something that
knows.
we don't.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
There is a large Indian community in Malaysia.
Yeah,
Maybe, a lot of Tamil live in Malaysia.
they do
Uh,
indeed.
isn't Dwayne The Rock Johnson like half Samoan, half African American? Maybe he got her mixed up with Dwayne The Rock Johnson.
Maybe, maybe. God help
Maybe.
me. I don't know. What a
So,
mess.
some of this hatred that we have towards Kamala 100 years ago would have been aimed at Irish. It would have been
Yeah.
aimed at Jews. It would have been aimed at Italians. So there has been a tradition of sort of hating the newer arrivals. But I feel like the vitriol is at a different level. Like, it's a little bit higher than it was 125 years ago. But yeah, I mean, it's a pastime to hate the other, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. From Dubai in the UAE, we're speaking with Professor of Government at Austin Community College, Texas, Dr. Roy Casagranda. Roy, now let's move on to the big issue. I mean, there's no bigger issue at the moment. Mind you, I say that with some caveats. I'll use the air quote, big issue. Big for people like us out here in the periphery, not so much for Americans themselves. Foreign policy. Do Harris and Trump represent different approaches to foreign policy? What impact might each have on America's global relationships? And which approach do you think would be most beneficial or risky on the international stage?
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like I have to throw out some caveats before we jump into this. For the most part, I despise U.S. foreign policy. There are, yeah, we are not good to our allies, and we randomly pick on poor countries that just, I don't know, we spun a globe and decided we hate that group. And then, I'll give you another anecdote. I asked a friend here in the UAE. I said, okay, I know how business is done in the United States, and I know how business is done in the Middle East. What happens when an American business comes and tries to do business in the UAE? And my friend knows because he's in business. So, or at least he has some experience with this. He said when U.S. businesses first came here, they would come in with these huge demands. And we would think, wow, they can't possibly be making these demands unless they really need them. So he said we would just cave into them, and we would end up with these awful deals where sometimes we were losing money. But we were thinking this was the beginning of a relationship. And then as time went by, it would morph into a better deal for us. And then we'd never hear from those Americans again. It was a one-off. It was purely transactional. They didn't care about us, and they walked away. He said, when we deal with Europeans, when we deal with other countries, it's all about relationship building. And so we know that we're going to have more dealings in the future. And we've now learned to just treat everything the United States does as transactional, that it's a one-off, that we're never going to see them again. And we've learned to play hardball with them. He said, when the Japanese come, we know we won't make a deal until we've invited them to our home so they can have dinner with our wives and our children. Otherwise, the Japanese won't sign. They won't sign the deal because for them, it's all about relationship. And I think that's the problem the United States has in its foreign policy. It's all about resource extraction. It's not about the long term. It's not about building relationships. We're willing to backstab anybody. And it's a little hard.
Doesn't that make doesn't that make Donald Trump the perfect president for the United States? I mean, ultimately, it's drill, baby, drill. It's all transactional, and he's prepared to walk away from everyone. So what you're saying, and look, full disclosure here, I've lived and worked in the UAE for a number of years as well, so I understand that story. I know that story well. But what we are seeing here is if the United States doesn't change fundamentally from the inside out, and it's left as it is currently constructed, the natural born American that runs that place, the only one is going to be Donald Trump. He is everything that encapsulates the very thing that you've just said about your friend in the UAE describing Americans being transactional, generally speaking. So, yeah, I don't know.
And that's the heartbreaking part of the story. I think one of the reasons why people are so interested in him is they see themselves in the same light, that they are also transactional and they're not interested in long-term development. So a cousin of mine and I had an argument recently where he was like, I can't stand the United States spend so much money overseas. And I go, I think we spend less than 0.1% of our GDP on foreign aid, and almost all of it is earmarked to buy our military equipment. So really, we get the money right back. We're just funding the murder machine. And I said, you know, like most Scandinavian states give 1% of their GDP. And specify you cannot buy weapons with it. You have to spend it on infrastructure and education and sanitation. And then what happens is that state has a little bit more money, a little bit more developed. There's less pressure to emigrate away. So then you get fewer immigrants going into Europe. And then there's also a population of people who have more money, so they're more likely to buy your products. And that argument just fell flat on him. He's like, I don't care. I'm like, I don't care about what happens in 20 years. I only care about this moment right here, right now. So in that way, I think you're right. Trump embodies this. So there's a problem with that, though. Our whole post-World War II strategy, and so much of what we did post-World War II is horrific. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. I'm not even sure we were on the right side in the Korean War, although maybe, I mean, when you look at North Korea and South Korea, it looks like maybe we're on the right side. But you know, we overthrew democracies, Syria in 49, Guatemala in 54, Iran in 53, just the blood, just horrific. But a piece of it was also to avoid World War III. That there was a formula for trying to navigate in such a way that we wouldn't have to do another big war. That part of it I approve of. The rest of it I'm not happy with. And the part that is, let's avoid a war, was that we would have a permanent presence in Europe and a permanent presence in East Asia, especially after the Korean War, when we went, oh, oops. And so much of European policy is built on this idea of NATO. If Trump is elected, I think every NATO member assumes that NATO will not come through if there is an expansion of the Ukraine war. For example, if Russia invades Latvia and Lithuania, I don't think the United States will do anything. It'll be up to Europe. And as a result, Germany has decided that it needs to go ahead and behave like the United States is no longer their ally. And Germany has passed legislation so that it will completely remilitarize. By the time it's done with its remilitarization program, it will have the third largest military on earth, right after China, right before Russia. And then, of course, Japan is remilitarizing. It already has aircraft carriers that it's pretending are destroyers. And I wouldn't be surprised if they have a nuclear weapons program. And, you know, so like Trump has already successfully, with one term, upended the entire post-World War II regime of how do we prevent World War III. And right now, we are in a position where there are flashpoints in the Middle East and there are flashpoints in Europe where this could easily devolve into a World War III scenario. So from that standpoint, I disapprove of American isolationism, this transactional attitude. I think Trump is a waiting disaster. He will destabilize the world more than it already is. Kamala isn't going to do anything wonderful or great or special based on what her past performance. I think she'll just go in and she'll keep the liberal old system in place. The United States will be a relatively reliable ally for its allies. We'll still seek to plunder the third world, and we'll still do militaristic things from time to time. But at least it's not a complete unraveling of the system that exists, where the United States does safeguard Europe and potentially Japan for that matter. What's happening between the Philippines and China right now is incredibly alarming. I mean, it's to the point where they're not shooting at each other, but they're punching each other on, atolls because there's probably petroleum and there are probably resources to be gained. And you think now is the time for a steady hand from the United States where you can't bully the Philippines, we'll step in. And I don't think anybody believes that's the case anymore. This isn't the United States from the 1970s. This is a new, strange United States.
Yes, yes, it is. But I suppose if you believed in what Trump has got going for him, he's the anti-war president of the moment. He'll create peace in Ukraine within a day of him assuming office. His
I can't
great
wait.
friend, Kim Jong-un is just going to
Yeah.
put away the nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and
Oh, so
it'll be
exciting.
it'll be the best ever peace deal in the history of the world. And guess who's going to do it? Me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy stuff. All right.
So
Yeah.
foreign policy is so complicated. Like there are
Mm,
so many tiny nuancy things. So for
yeah.
example, when Trump was elected in 2017,
Mm,
Taiwan called.
mm,
So what every president has been doing since the 70s, at least, it might be before then, is when Taiwan calls to congratulate the new president, we don't pick up because the caller ID says Taiwan and we don't want to piss off the People's Republic of China.
mm,
Trump picked it up
mm.
and caused an international incident. Why did he pick it up? Probably because he doesn't know. It's probably not because he had some amazing political agenda, some kind of crazy plan. He's just probably an idiot and doesn't know. He upended all of the United States' post-Korean War diplomacy with Kim Jong-un when he's meeting with them and shaking his hand and hanging out. You can say, well, maybe it's for the better. The problem is these types of situations are really scary and dangerous. You need to navigate them carefully, cautiously, and not just kind of bulldoze your way through. I'm trying to imagine what kind of peace settlement he makes for Ukraine. And he has said the Israelis need to finish the Palestinians. Finish them? That's the language of genocide.
Oh,
Is
no, no,
that
hang
what
on, hang on, hang on. You can say that because you're in Dubai. Say that in the United States, and you'll have all sorts of
I'm
great.
fired?
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, the G word is not to be spoken about. So
Right,
yeah,
it's not to
but
be
but but
spoken.
but that's an interesting thing too. I mean, like uh, we were speaking to Scott Lucas a few days back, and there was a time when Donald Trump was about to send aircraft in to take out Iran, whatever the hell that meant. But
Yeah,
there were fighters about to leave to go and do the
he gave
job.
the order.
Yes, yes. So that was a very close call for a so-called anti-war president to actually then open up an open-ended war with Iran and between Iran and the US, I should say. So I'm not so convinced that he's going to be the steady hand that we need in situations like this. But again, I come back to the fact that, you know, Kamala Harris under the Biden administration, oh, admittedly, she hasn't had a great role in the sort of international relations aspect of things, the hands-on aspect. I mean, that was always within Biden's purview. But, under the Biden administration, we've seen crap go down in Haiti. It's on your doorstep, for crying out loud. No one's doing anything about that. And when
Yeah.
they come up with these convoluted ideas about Kenyan-led police forces going there, US money and Canadian money coming in left, right, and center, and you've still got gangs running around raping and pillaging their way through Port-au-Prince and various other large towns. I mean, that again doesn't instill a great deal of confidence for those people looking to the United States for leadership to help sort out local problems. I mean, we've got problems in Sudan. We've got problems between Egypt and Ethiopia. I mean, all of these flashpoints. It's not just, East Asia. Yeah, we can always talk about China as the big bear in the room, but or Russia for that matter. But there are these smaller conflicts that if they go up, I mean, we could very well be talking about genocide with a capital G in many cases. So yeah, where's the US in all of that? And Harris, I don't know. Where is she on that?
So So let's do Trump just a little bit more, and then I want to switch to Harris. So,
Yep.
like one of the things was murdering the Iranian general.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name off the top of my head. That was dangerous. That could have easily continued to escalate. And the Iranians did respond. So Trump said, as long as the Iranians don't respond, we're good. The Iranians immediately responded and wounded something like 200 American soldiers. They didn't kill anybody, but they wounded them. And he went, I guess they're not going to respond. I'm okay. So I guess he didn't care that they had hurt so many people. So he's, in that regard, he's completely reckless. The word in the room was that they had given him this is one extreme that we shouldn't do. This is another, this is not doing anything. We shouldn't do that. We need to do something in the middle. And he picked the extreme position. And they were like, oh my God, no, you're not supposed to do the extreme one. According to James Mattis, Trump gave the order to attack both Venezuela and Iran. And James Mattis literally ignored it, which is unconstitutional, because Trump is the commander-in-chief. Actually, technically, Trump giving the order is unconstitutional also, but we won't get into that because Congress, like a bunch of idiots, passed a law giving the president the authority. So over to Kamala. So Kamala represents the old way of doing things. She is the person who's going to get in there. She's going to support the genocides she likes. She's not going to necessarily save the Haitians just because something bad happened to them. The United States has a long history of abusing Haiti and making things worse. At one point, we sent in the Marines and occupied the place. And so we've done coup d'etat after coup d'etat in Haiti. We're not the guys to fix Haiti. Ironically enough, Canada sends Haiti more money when it comes to foreign aid than the United States, even though the United States is 9 times larger than Canada. You would think we would be the ones sending the larger chunk of money. So something needs to be done for places like Haiti. Something needs to be done to mitigate the Ethiopia-Egypt conflict. I mean, Egypt is literally threatening to bomb Ethiopia to stop them from putting their dam online. There needs to be a state that has legitimacy and authority that can stand up and say, hey, we can resolve this. Maybe you can fill the dam a little bit slower, for example, right? And the United States doesn't have a voice like that anymore, in part because I think we've lost so much legitimacy over the decades, but in part because I think we've given up on that. We're so focused on the ridiculous arguments inside the United States about, whether we should ban drag queens from performing. Texas passed a law banning drag queens, and I think, does that apply to geishas? Because I'm trying to figure out what the difference between a drag queen and a geisha is if I were to describe them. So they made it clear it only applies to men. Isn't that sexist? Anyway, so how we got into these conversations, like when was the last time I was assaulted by a drag queen? I don't know why I would want to ban them. I get confused how this is an issue. And of course, I think part of it is it's just, how do I ramp up the voters, get them really emotional about something so I can get them to show up and vote? And because of that, we're neglecting the role that we should have globally. We've become unreliable. There's nobody to step in and take our place. Well, except the PRC is slowly doing it. Was it last year? I think it was last year. Yeah, last year, the PRC brokered a deal between Saudi and Iran, between Saudi and Syria, and between Saudi and Yemen. And things got a little bit calmer when that happened. And, the PRC got to walk away with the medal for that. So maybe there is a hope in the sense that they're taking a larger role. It's just they have a history of bullying just like the United States. So it looks like another United States taking this role. I wish the United States would just dump the bullying and then become the good guy that it always pretends it's been.
Oh, wow. Okay. Now, last few questions, if you don't mind, Roy. Let's see if we can go on to a little happier topics. I don't think that there are any happier topics. No, sorry.
A thing?
No, it's not a thing. I'm just tricking you. Right?
I was going to say, I'm a political scientist. We don't do happy.
No. Although for a depressing topic, we've had a good laugh. So let's have a look here. All right. Okay. So you obviously listened to the Joe Rogan interview with Trump.
I listened to part of it. Yeah.
Yeah,
That was
man.
amazing.
I tortured myself. I listened to the whole bloody thing, all
Okay, I
three
should do
hours of
that.
it, and
Wow.
the headache that I had afterwards was amazing. That entire interview was based on a bunch of rambling non sequiturs, and it's
I
like
mean, the
you
parts
know.
that I heard were just rambling non sequiturs.
And Trump tried to grease the wheels with Joe by talking about the UFC fighting aspect, which is okay, it's okay for some, but not for others. I'm not really into it myself, quite frankly. But whatever floats one's boat, I suppose. But it was just so goddamn long and rambling and terrible. But what are your thoughts on how the media has covered both candidates? Are there any narratives that you feel that have been exaggerated or even underreported when it comes to Trump and Harris?
You know, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around how a guy who launched an attempted coup d'etat on January 6th is being treated with the normality that he is. Like, why the press in the United States, once you're a president, once you're a senator, you're always a senator. You're always a president. So, right, President Jimmy Carter, we don't say former President Jimmy Carter. The press has had to say that with Trump because they realized if they don't say former President Trump, that the voters who believe he didn't lose 2020 and Trump who
That's
believes he
right.
will, they'll get confused. Like he's forced us to change the way we even talk about people. Um,
Yeah.
so for me, we've downplayed the stuff that Trump has done, and we've sort of gotten this collective amnesia where we need to hit. He tried to stop the election from going through. That's not okay. That shouldn't be a thing. Abraham Lincoln is fighting the Civil War. The United States is on the verge of possibly being split into two. All right. They're coming up on the election. It's 1864 election. They're in the middle of a civil war. Now they've had some recent victories, so he's got that on his side. But his advisors are telling him postpone the election. Everybody will understand. And Abraham Lincoln's response was, "No, we can't postpone the election." The guy running against him was a former Yankee general, George McClellan. His platform was, "I will end the Civil War by letting the South go." In other words, if Lincoln loses this election, the United States breaks into two. And Lincoln doesn't have polling data. He doesn't really know where he is in the mind of the average voter. It could be in any direction. It's a black box. And he says, if I don't postpone this election, no one will ever have an excuse to postpone an election. Because if ever there was a time to do it, it's now. I want to set that precedent. That's the caliber of a person that we had in that moment. And so to compare that to, I'm going to send a mob to attack the Capitol building to prevent the vote from being certified by Congress is just so mind-boggling. And the only person that I know of who ever tried to do a coup while they were in office is Santa Anna, the president of Mexico. He actually did a coup d'etat against his own presidency when he was elected president and overthrew himself. So Trump and him they're in that same interesting category. I mean,
Crazy,
Santa Anna,
crazy. Yeah.
Trump failed. So I guess there's that difference. Oh, for the record, Santa Anna is the guy that introduced chewing gum to the United States.
Good.
Yeah. So
Nice
he's not
legacy.
all. Yeah, that. His legacy was ruining Mexico and chewing gum. It's fantastic. Trump is a fascist. He is appealing to the religious right. He has a platform that makes him look like he wants to create a theocracy in the United States. He keeps saying, I have nothing to do with the platform, but we all know he does. And he'll surround himself with the same people that he had last time, except probably fewer people that will say no to him. Like there's probably not going to be a Kelly and there's not going to be a Mattis in that government, which is frightening. So he'll just be surrounded by sycophant yes men who will do his bidding. And I think the press needs to focus on that more and talk about it. My fear is that every time the press talks about him, it's good for him because we're bringing him into the forefront and putting him into people's minds. Any press is good press.
Yeah.
On the other side, it would be great if Kamala decided she was going to do something interesting It's too late, maybe, because there's only a week left. But why not? Why not throw it out? This could be her October surprise. She comes out tomorrow and says, I've changed my mind. We're going to do X, Y, and Z for the economy. I'm going to work for the working class. I'm going to change US foreign policy so that we're doing stuff that's more moderate. It would be exciting. It would be really interesting. And she has the ability to do it. She's probably going to lose. If the election happened today, based on the polling data, she's going to lose. So at that point, what does she have to lose? She might as well go crazy and do it. I feel like the press, it would be great if the press would spend more time trying to pin her down on specifics of her policies instead of talking about the salient, high-profile emotional issues. But the press isn't going to do that because the American public will get bored and they just want to hear about the crazy. And so that's where we are.
All right. So the final two questions. Roy, how do Trump and Harris's economic visions differ? And what do you foresee as the practical implications of their approaches for the American middle class?
So, I mean, I think substantively, neither party has ever really differed that much, with exceptions, right? In 1932, FDR came in and he said, look, we have to save capitalism. The only way to do that is we're going to have to introduce some socialism to vaccinate the public against socialism. And so that was the idea behind the New Deal. And the Republicans were like, no, capitalism is perfect in its pure form. Yeah, everybody's suffering because of the Great Depression, but it'll eventually work its way out. But that was the conversation. By the 1950s, the Republican Party platform under Eisenhower, when Eisenhower was running for president, said the Republican Party supports and believes that the unions are the backbone of the American workforce. The party that hates unions, the Republican Party in the 1950s, was saying how much they loved unions. And so as a general rule in American politics, once there's a big change and the public goes in that direction, the other party will chase it. So in the Clinton administration, he was a Democrat, but he looked like a Republican in so many ways. And in part, it was because the Democratic Party decided they had to chase the Reagan Republicans. Unfortunately, the end result is that you'll get the kind of conversation you have between Trump and Kamala, where there isn't really any substantive difference. Like Kamala's saying, I want to help the working class. Trump's saying, I'm going to go serve food at a McDonald's because I'm capable of helping the working class. And you're like, and then Kamala saying, I used to work at a McDonald's. And you're like, oh my God, who cares? We both know you're rich elitists. What does this have to do with anything?
It's crazy.
And that's the level of the conversation. So I don't think there'll be a meaningful shift either way, other than probably Trump will cut taxes for the rich again. For the record, he never cut taxes for rich. What he keeps claiming is a tax cut was a tax compression. He took, I think it was 9 tax brackets and compressed them into 5. So if you were in the most expensive tax bracket, you did get a tax cut because when it got compressed with the lower bracket, they averaged the rate. But if you were at the bottom of the lower bracket, your taxes went up because the rate went up on that lower bracket. So I'll just full disclosure, that was me. I was at the bottom of a tax bracket, so my taxes actually went up. I didn't get a tax cut, I got a tax hike. But the rich did get it. And that was his gimmick, right? Was I'll pretend I'm not cutting taxes for the rich when all I'm doing is cutting taxes for the rich. He'll probably do another thing like that. That past experience, every time you cut taxes for the rich, it's a drag on the economy, and the economy goes in the wrong direction. So I suspect that'll happen. And then if you vote for Kamala, I expect a bunch of nothing will happen. Build Back Better was a great idea when it was $3 trillion. By the time they cut it down to $1 trillion, it was better than nothing. They had to rename it, right? They call it the Inflation Reduction Act because Build Back Better, I guess, was too many B's. And, you know, it was nice, but it was about 1% of what the United States actually needed. So we would need to do that another 99 times. Odds are that really good that the United States House will flip back to the Democratic Party with like maybe a 2 or 3 seat majority. And the odds are really good that the United States Senate will flip from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party with like a 1 or 2 seat majority. So we're going to get another split Congress, very likely, and that Kamala won't be able to get any legislation through because the Republicans will just block it. And even if the Democrats somehow end up with the majority in the Senate, the Republicans will filibuster because they have that ability. So she'll have to rule by executive order, which is, what monarchs do. They make decrees.
They do. They do.
Why are we a republic if we're just going to elect a lame duck president with a Congress that doesn't do its job?
Okay, so final question. As someone who takes a huge interest in the history of societies, Roy, if you were a future historian, what would you make of the 2024 presidential campaign? Are our takes on Trump and Harris complete media-fueled exaggerations, or are we really facing some risk of a transformational event?
So I wish we were facing some kind of transformation on the Kamala side. I just don't see any meaningful change on her side. If we had elected Bernie Sanders, I don't think we would have seen any meaningful change because he would have been stuck with a Congress that wasn't going to work with him anyway.
Yeah.
Like the Democratic Party wouldn't have worked with him, let alone the Republican Party. So one of the problems that we have in the United States is we have a system that has bogged itself down to the point where it won't function anymore. I think we're going to have to make a decision. It's 2024. We live in a high-tech civilization where we're about to unleash AI. We already have at some level. But I have a sneaky suspicion we're going to start putting AI into political decision-making processes. And we're going to start surrendering some of our autonomy not just the mundane, boring stuff. I can't wait for the mundane, boring stuff to be turned over, but on some of the really important decisions as well. You would think we would want to have a functioning government in those circumstances. In the case of Trump, I do think he will bring in change. I think his agenda is very much to upend the U.S. Republic. If I were Trump, so I'm projecting, and I had tried to launch a coup d'etat and I failed, and then I got elected after that, I would think that was a message from the American public saying we want your coup d'etat after all. We made a mistake. And I would want to implement that. He has said this will be the last election if I'm elected. He has said I will tear up the Constitution on day one if I'm elected. A cousin of mine recently said I'm voting for the dictator. And I thought, wow, you're actually admitting that that's what you want. That's the result. So at some level, I think an election of Trump is a surrendering of the United States Republic. And I'm kind of baffled by that because I think most people see the United States as this interesting experiment. And if I were going to write a book in 100 years, looking back, I would be lamenting the failure of the experiment. And I would want to blame somebody. I want to blame somebody right now, even not in the future. I really think that Reagan and his education cuts. It's 44 years later. I was in school when he was cutting taxes and cutting education spending. And as a person who's been an educator for decades, I really feel like we've seen the fruits of those education cuts. And it has led us to this moment. Because when I think about it, I think of the electoral republics that are doing well and aren't having these kinds of problems. They are clearly the better educated republics, the ones that have, we've seen the rise of the right everywhere. So that's even in the educated republics. But their systems still seem to be functioning. Like the United States is the only republic that has deep roots. So I'm not obviously talking about Hungary, but the only republic that has deep roots, that's a developed state that looks like it's on the verge of collapsing tomorrow. Like the UK will make it. It's a mess, but it'll get through the mess. India, I think, will make it. But the US, I'm not convinced will make it. And I can't believe we're here and I can't believe we're having this conversation. And so I would have to rename the information age the idiot age. That would be the self-inflicted suffering age. Like there's no reason on earth to do any of this. We have so much wealth accumulated on this planet, a little distribution would dramatically improve the quality of life for everybody. And then those people would have money to buy products. It would stimulate the global economy. Hoarding is exactly the wrong thing to do. And then the amount of energy we're spending on genocide and wars. Imagine if we were trying to colonize Mars with that energy, or here's an idea, fight global warming with that energy. Like, I just can't believe we're here in this moment having this conversation in 2024. I'm so disappointed.
I share your disappointment. Roy Casagranda, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights on The Focus.
Thank you for having me.
From Dubai, UAE, that was Professor of Government at Austin Community College, Dr. Roy Casagranda. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Roy Casagranda. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Roy and connect with him on social media. Now, on to questions for the audience. After hearing Dr. Casagranda's analysis, do you feel more confident about who should lead America, Trump or Harris? Do you think the media has been fair in covering both candidates? Which narratives about Trump or Harris do you believe are most accurate or misleading? How do you feel each candidate's approach to foreign policy and global relations would impact America's position on the world stage? What concerns, if any, do you have about how either a Trump or Harris presidency could affect trust in America's institutions and the future of democracy? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about this podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many of them as I can. My thanks as ever to producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor, and follow The Focus on X at @thefocus_sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.